What is Christian moral theology? It entails moral discourse, deliberation, and discernment on questions of personal, ecclesial, social, and political ordering as informed and formed by Christian theology and practice. In other words, it's a multifaceted activity. Moral theology can't be an independent discipline. It depends on other theological disciplines as well as secular disciplines. I can't do my job alone. I have to be in conversation with other people who know other things. Now, the definition I gave you is admittedly an imprecise one. In fact, it's actually a very vague definition. For it raises more questions than it answers. Yet even asking questions may help us to gain some clarity about what we should be doing and some sense of direction about where we should be heading in a class on Christian moral theology. So let's explore a few questions and see where they might lead us. First, what is moral or what is morality? In its most classic form, morality represents thought and practice that focuses on one-third of the Platonic and Neoplatonic triumvirate of the true, the good, and the beautiful. In that scheme, metaphysics describes what is true, aesthetics what is beautiful, and morality or ethics about what is good. Now, these three, of course, cannot be entirely separated or isolated from each other. But what is good is also true and beautiful. For example, if you ever looked at a marital or parent-child relationship and you say that's good, there's also something true and beautiful about it. So the good is not isolated from that which is beautiful, that which is true. But we will be focusing in this class primarily on the question of the good. And then the more important question is, once we think we know what is good, how do we align our thinking and our action to that good? So in other words, once you have an idea of what good is, how do you shape your life accordingly? How do you align yourself with that good? In short, the good enables us to know the difference between right and wrong, and thereby to do good and avoid evil. In other words, one of the things we'll find in this class is that eventually the task of moral theology is to help us make a decision. We decide to do this and not that. We decide that that is right and that is wrong. But as we look through the history of Christianity, we realize oftentimes we were in error. And we have to reformulate, again, the question in order to get a better approximation of what the good is. Now, I think this is similar to what St. Augustine has in mind in the short treatise that I inflicted upon you. The good Bishop of Hippo writes about happiness. By this, he does not mean a banal cheerfulness or a pleasant sensation or sentiment, a warm fuzzy. Rather, the truly happy person is one who desires and knows the good and aligns one's life accordingly. More pointedly, the truly happy person is one who desires and knows the highest or supreme good, which is God. In other words, Augustine simply makes the rather startling assertion: not to know God is to condemn oneself on happiness. The truly happy person has her priorities rightly aligned. In other words, we place God at the highest, at the apex. And from there, all other lesser goods are ordered accordingly. Lesser goods such as relationships, community, country, career, possessions. So that the unhappy person is the one whose priorities are out of alignment. If you love success more than you love God, your life is out of alignment and you will be unhappy. Now, you may not know you're unhappy, but in fact, can't be happy according to Augustine because the priorities aren't strict. And this is a more, I mean, the one example I can use is pretty easy. We've all seen, heart-rendering movies about the, greedy person who has conversion. But this makes some very, very painful decisions at times. For example, I've been married 38 years. And I sometimes wonder, do I love my wife more than God? And if I do, then according to Augustine, I'm condemned to unhappiness because I don't love God more than my wife. And that's a tough go because I think if I'm left alone, I'm going to have a serious quarrel with God. But again, that's always the question that we must be asking in Christian moral theology is, are our priorities aligned correctly with that which is good and the greatest good as well? People who serve a lesser good as if it were the greatest good are both a result and cause of unhappiness because they have placed their trust and devotion in something that cannot satisfy their deepest longings and desires. The reason idolatry fails is because it can't deliver what it promises. If you place your hope, place your desires in something like a BMW, you're going to be unhappy because it can't deliver what you think it can. Place our trust and devotion in a lesser good rather than God is, as I said, idolatry. And idols always fail us because they distort and disfigure the ordering of our priorities. In other words, even in a deep and profound love with other people can't save us. They will fail us. In this respect, sin is not so much wickedness, although there are wicked people in the world, but a consequence of disordered desire. The problem with sin is not so much that we desire bad things. More often than not, we desire good things badly. In other words, there's nothing wrong with the desire to earn a degree at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Not a thing wrong with it. But if you plagiarize or you hire a ghostwriter, you desire a good thing badly. Because part of the whole exercise is learning to write in your own voice. So again, the quest for security is not a bad desire. But if you think the only way you can be secure is to completely kill your enemy, then you desire that good security badly. Because you no longer respect the enemy for enemy. So that's always the question and that's what makes it such a particularly difficult question in ethics. Is again, we're not always dealing with clear-cut difference between good and evil. More often than not, we're dealing with disordered desire. An inability to really begin to align our lives in the proper way that it should be aligned with the greatest good. Now, much of the evil that we encounter is not the result then of malicious intent, although there are malicious people in the world, but a consequence of misplaced priorities, ignorance, bad judgment, inattentiveness, laziness, or just plain stupidity. As we'll talk a little bit later, that's what you see in the book, The Accidental Man. The characters in that book are not particularly wicked. They are incredibly stupid. Hannah Arendt was fond of admonishing her readers and students to stop and think. So much of the evil of the world results from thoughtlessness. We simply don't think through what we are doing. And to a large extent, she's right. It's wise advice. But it is question begging. How do we know what the good is? What is good? In order to avoid doing what is evil? And how should we order our lives accordingly in this respect? And this is where we encounter Verhey's notions of discourse, deliberation, and discernment. It's a process. Now, Discourse is essentially language or communication. It's just a fancy two-bit academic word. Conversing. To converse is an important element in what it means to be a human being. Never discount the significance of talking or conversing. St. Augustine once observed in a way that offends our late modern sensibilities that a dog provides better companionship than someone who speaks a foreign and untranslatable language. Why is discourse so important, particularly for moral theology? First, because language expresses intent. Language expresses intent. If I intend to illumine, I tell the truth. If I intend to deceive, I tell a lie. So the language itself discloses the intent. Secondly, language forms character. Habitually telling the truth forms us as truth tellers. Habitually telling lies deforms us into liars. And thirdly, language both reveals and it occludes. It discloses and it hides. Telling you that I am a teacher reveals something true about who I am, but it hides much else. So remember, all language always reveals and it also hides. And that's because language is always ambiguous, but it's nonetheless important. Don't worry about it. This is how you do it. So remember that, and that is in a sense, it's appropriate then that language is what we use to communicate in terms of theology. Because truth by its very nature is never obvious. It can't be obvious. Because truth is now multi-layered, richly fabricated in the notion of truth. And this is why words are important, because of the extent to which they do shape us, how we communicate. I think it's very interesting that the importance of particularly oral communication, of listening. Ken Burns once had a documentary on the history of radio. And his closing scene was an old newsreel. The reporter is interviewing about a 10-year-old boy. And he says, "Sonny, have your parents bought that new invention, television?" He goes, "Oh, yes, sir." He says, "Well, do you watch it every night?" He says, "Oh, no, sir." He says, "Well, what do you do?" He says, "Well, I listen to the radio." He says, "Why?" "Pictures are better." So it's the notion that words actually, because of the very ambiguity, forces you to do interpretation, forces you to come to some understanding. And this is why there's always a caution in making moral judgments, because we cannot know the truth in its entirety. We cannot know the good in its entirety, at least this side of eternity. Now, one but certainly not the only task of Christian moral theology then is to engage in discourse that truthfully discloses the good which is God. But we also acknowledge that we cannot say everything there is to say about God, that some if not many things remain unknown and hidden. To borrow from St. Paul, our knowledge of God will always be partial and never complete. But should invoke in us a sense of humility and readiness to correct our discourse when it proves misguided or mistaken. Nothing wrong with saying I was wrong. This has been, as painful as that might be, to admit that one is in error is part of moral wisdom. And you should actually be grateful to the person who points out the error of your ways. Note also that discourse is not something we do in solitude. We need partners to have conversations with. And in this respect, writing and reading are actually conversational activities, because we argue with writers in our head when we're reading and writing. Even reading and writing is a conversational activity, because you can't invent your own language and talk with yourself. We can, but what's the point? Since our knowledge of God is partial and imperfect, and therefore our discourse about God is in need of correction, discourse must also inspire and depend upon deliberation. We need to think about what we do, think about what we read, to think about our acts. Deliberation is a corporate or communal enterprise, a loving argument or lover's quarrel, if you will, in which we help each other to think as clearly as we can about the greatest good, which is God, and what the love of God and neighbor requires of us. And again, these are highly complex and controversial questions. How do we love our neighbor? And again, the answers are not always clear. For example, in a global economy, how do we love neighbors that we never meet? And yet, we're absolutely dependent on them. We have hundreds of transactions with them every day. Think for a moment, when you click on Amazon, you're engaging hundreds of invisible people. They are your neighbors. And thinking about this, for example, how do we love neighbors that happen to be our enemies? Is it permissible to use drones? Or is there something wrong about it? The mode of conversation, therefore, when engaging in this type of deliberation, is always interrogative, always question-based. Asking questions that prompt further questions, and promoting rather than trying to silence conversation. I mean, one of the distressing things, in my opinion, about contemporary culture is that moral debate has turned into a form of professional wrestling. You simply turn it into drama and silence the opposition, but never really engage. So we really don't have debates, we have shouting matches. And it's true on both the left and the right. So the question is, how do we really converse with people that we are not always in agreement with? The discourse employed is critical, as I've mentioned, but always charitable, recognizing the limits of language and its need for correction. So, for example, we have to deliberate on the divine command to love our neighbors. But who exactly is my neighbor? That's not an original question. There are neighbors that are near, and there are neighbors that are far. There are neighbors who are strangers, neighbors who are confidants, neighbors who are friends, and neighbors who are enemies. By the way, as a slight digression, the opposite of a friend is not an enemy. Anyone know what the opposite of a friend is?
Stranger?
No. A flatterer. Someone who flatters you is the opposite of a friend, because the flatterer has holds you in such disrespect that they don't even feel an obligation to tell you the truth. They simply tell you what you think you want to hear. Pardon?
Is that a flatterer or is that a friend?
No, that's a flatterer. A friend will tell you the truth, no matter how painful it might be.
Oh, not in today's society.
Well, we may live in a society where we don't have many friends, but we have an abundance of flatterers. Now, a very interesting discourse, if you want to read it sometimes, book 3, Polycraticus, written by John Salisbury, where he writes an entire essay on why flattery is reserving the right to slay the tyrant. Because you hold the tyrant in such disrespect that you're reserving the right to kill him. So you flatter him. And this is why you should always be very suspicious. And this is a great temptation. There are people in congregations in any organization that you're in a certain position, they will flatter you. Beware of them.
I think also, people, like, I'm very extroverted, and I like to share, when I see cool things in people's life, I like to share that with them. I have absolutely no expectation that they will believe me. In today's context, it doesn't seem, it's like, just because you're outgoing and you can tell someone what you see in them and that you appreciate those things, doesn't mean that they should open their doors quicker to you, or allow themselves to be vulnerable quicker, or to put their trust in you. And it still needs to be something that's earned. You can't just take that at face value.
Right, and I think that's why we've given insufficient attention within Christian theology on the importance of something like friendship, and how rare that is, and what a great gift and blessing true friendship is. And we tend to be becoming increasingly casual and superficial. And I think the reason being for that is that increasingly we are able and we prefer to go along. Because you'll see that in Cherry Turtle, where the title of the book is very revealing, Alone Together. I mean, particularly, I'll be interested in the reaction to her horrified realization that her friends consistently text message during the funeral. And so I think we live in a culture which increasingly has no use for friendship, because friendship is actually an impediment. We use one another, but friendship gets in the way, because you have to be accountable to a friend. But increasingly, accountability prevents our mobility, and who wants to be stuck? Yeah.
Well, I was thinking too, beyond the immobility thing, because I think that is the case that when you make true friendships, one thing is whether or not we want friendships to be kind of flash fire friendships that are good for the period of time that they last for, or whether we want them to have longevity. And there seems to be kind of this shift between those people who really want lifelong friendships versus those people who want, like, here, now, for the moment, you serve a purpose, and whether or not that's a good thing. And
well, I mean, and look, I mean, it's not to say that there's a certain utility in all relationships that we shouldn't be offended by the fact that we use one another.
Mhm.
I mean, you're using me, right?
Yeah.
You got to get 3 units required course, or you're using me to fulfill requirement.
You're
That's
using
fine.
us to get paid, right?
Actually, I don't. I'm a Dale. But
lie to us.
pardon?
Lie to us.
Yes, I need to anything. But yeah, I need indirectly, because you got to keep the institution open, for the poor faculty of Martindale, but that doesn't matter anyway. But we do use each other for different kinds of things. And then there's some people where, look, we just enjoy their company. We're just fun to be around. But my God, any long-term relationship, no. And there's nothing, again, there's nothing wrong with that as long as you aren't cruel. There are some people that you've made lifelong commitments to, and that means you're accountable and you change your life for them. And then ultimately, the more interesting theological question is, when do we become friends with God?
Well, does accountability mandate mutuality?
What?
Are accountability and mutuality, like, are they always reciprocal? Because if that's the case, I mean,
That's a very interesting question, because I mean, if you look at the ancient understanding of friendship, only peers could be friends. An inferior and superior could not be friends.
right.
This is what the tyrant has no friends. The tyrant is the loneliest person in the world, because there are no peers. And to a large extent, I think that's probably right. It doesn't mean, though, you can't treat other people in a friendly manner.
But is that flattery?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, if I tell you you did a good job in the paper, I'm not flattering.
Okay.
Uh,
So then, So then, in that case, if you if you can be friendly with someone who's not an equal,
Right.
then do you lose accountability in that inequality?
Well, this is where it gets multifaceted. I mean, in the teacher-student relationship, I know this sounds contrary to the pleasant rhetoric you hear, but we are not equal. We're just not. But in Christ, we are. So you can hold me accountable as a brother in Christ. Now, don't try that in the classroom because you have to pay. But in another setting, that could very well be the case that as a brother in Christ, I beseech you, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And there is that accountability because we are all equal in one in Christ. I mean, this was the great mischief that Christianity played in the pagan world because they said by nature all people, contrary to pagans who believe that by nature there are inferior and superior people, namely superior people are Athenian free men and everyone else is a barbarian. Christians said no, to the contrary, there is an ontological equality. Now that does not get played out necessarily in functional equality because like it or not, we all believe in hierarchies. Because if you don't believe that's the case, then I assume the next time you need surgery, you won't mind if I just grab the first person off the street, give them a scalpel, and say, have a go. You want a hierarchy when it comes to surgery. You want a functional hierarchy. That doesn't make the doctor ontologically superior to you, but you do want the doctor with skills.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing as when you get on a commercial airline, you don't ask, would someone like to fly the plane? So ontological equality, in other words, equality of being does not necessarily, we'll get into this later in the course, equality of being does not necessarily translate into equality of treatment.
Okay.
In fact, one could argue that in order to secure justice, you have to treat some people differently. Because if you really believe in equality of treatment as being equality of being, then I assume none of you think, and I assume all of you believe that the reservation tax is immoral. If you believe it's strict quality treatment.
No, but you're saying it puts you in mind as well as the sort of equal authority. And in that authority can be friendly, but authority doesn't have to be your friend. It will have to include. So, like, for instance, in a parent-child relationship, probably the first thought, or even, about civil authority. They have responsibility to carry out.
Right.
And so, whether we get along per se is ancillary to the fact that they have a job.
Right, and authority is a very interesting question because someone like Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, says the problem of the modern world is that there is no more authority, there's only power. And the problem with that is then it's simply the strong lording it over the weak. Where authority is really not a bad word. What it simply says is, I am authorized to do this, but no more. So as a parent, I'm authorized to provide for the well-being of my child. I'm not authorized to perform surgery on it. And that's what really authority is saying, is that authority limits rather than enables. Authority says basically you can go this far and no farther. Now the debate becomes then, how far does authority extend? And what are the proper limits of authority? And we'll be getting into that quite a bit. So you go there and there.
My question is about accountability, which you were talking about earlier. That, as you mentioned about pagan world, in contemporary culture, especially sitting in the West, I'm from East, but where individualism and private rights and personal space and those things, people are very sensitive and prone to those things, then how can we bring this piece of friendship and accountability to each other, like in Christ you said? How can that be practically seen in day-to-day lives, not in the classroom setting, but in a community setting?
That's a very good question. I wish I was more vocal. I think increasingly in the West, for a very long time, and now increasingly on a global scale, because again, they get in the way. They constrain the economy. And as we'll look at in the emerging technoculture, we're increasingly a nomadic. The global world is a world of nomads. They don't want to be tied down. Now, I'm somewhat